Last week, the UN significantly revised their estimate on civilian casualties in Gaza. Prior to last week, it was widely reported that 9,500 women and 14,500 children had been killed in Gaza since Israel responded to Hamas's terrorist attack. Now, those numbers have been almost halved, with it being estimated that 5,000 women and 8,000 children have lost their lives. And while the revision is significant, there are some who have pointed out the UN's flawed record keeping. One of those critics is Dr. Abraham Wyner, statistics professor at Wharton School. Dr. Wyner, thank you for joining us today.
Great to join you.
We know that the UN has revised their figures significantly, but you highlighted some of these issues in March. What led you to your conclusion months ago, and why do you think that the original figures were accepted at face value for so long?
Well, what led me to think that there was a problem was the UN figures didn't give any space for Hamas fighters, which we knew that they weren't differentiating between civilians. And so if you just looked at what they were reporting, there had to be way too many women and children being reported and far too few fighters. And that was really important from Hamas's perspective, because it gave the incorrect idea that Israel was just indiscriminately bombing, in which case it would be mostly civilians. But in fact, as we now know, the actual numbers of civilians is much, much lower, and the totals aren't that much different, which means that what Israel has been doing is fighting against weapons and soldiers and fighters, and that civilians who are dying in somewhat large numbers is more what we call collateral damage in a war.
We know that the original estimates were largely based on figures that Hamas's health ministry, despite the fact that they are run by Hamas. Do they have a track record for accurately reporting civilian deaths?
Well, they have a track record of accurately reporting the total number of casualties. I don't think they have an accurate track record of reporting the number of fighters. In fact, in previous wars with Hamas, they have significantly revised the number of fighters who have died, generally way, way higher, sometimes over a year or even longer after the battles have ended. So they report the total number of dead, and they have done that relatively accurately, but those were very small encounters with Israel where there was lots of international observers. This is much different, and so I think what you will see here is those early data shouldn't have been relied upon, in my view.
And if we were to roll back the clock, how exactly would one accurately estimate civilian deaths in such a complicated urban warfare setting?
There really isn't any way to accurately estimate the number of civilian deaths. That's the kind of thing that would happen months down the line. The idea that you could do that in such a setting was, I think, a mistake to widely accept those numbers coming out, which really just gross approximations, also propaganda as well. And it should have been left as something to be studied and looked at much later. The fact that civilians were dying alone, we knew that was happening. Israel was not pretending that it wasn't happening. It just was the kind of things that you expect to see in urban war, and we should have just left it at that and let the numbers get sorted out once the battles are over.
And of course, the original flawed figures certainly played a role in major decisions, both in the world of geopolitics and international law. How much do you think these figures have factored in the decision to accuse Israel of the genocide and even to potentially seek an ICC arrest warrant for the Israel prime minister?
Well, it's hard to know, but I would say overwhelmingly. I mean, I couldn't say that any stronger. The idea that Israel has been indiscriminately bombing and just meting out what they would call collective punishment against a population has been a position that has been buttressed by numbers that are incorrect. And if the numbers were much more accurate and they reflected the fact that Israel was actually fighting soldiers, or they aren't, by the way, the soldiers aren't dressed in uniform. That's important for everyone to understand. So you can't tell a civilian from a soldier just by looking at what they're wearing or where they're found. But if that were understood, then I think these charges, certainly the charge of genocide, which is ridiculous the whole time, would be much more transparently ridiculous.
And as someone who looks at these types of statistical issues professionally, how does this conflict compare to others in terms of reporting accuracy?
Well, I looked at the data to look for inconsistencies, and other encounters and wars might have that as well. Some of the things that I've looked at, I haven't seen that. And I can tell you that in generally urban confrontations, like, for example, the United States in Mosul, they tended to kill far, far more civilians per every militant or fighter that they were able to kill. Here with Israel, it's more on a 1-to-1 ratio, maybe slightly higher than 1-to-1, but pretty close. And what the numbers are now showing is that which was Israel's contention all along, is what actually has happened.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
When we return from the commercial break, we'll have our weekly medical segment.